Almost halfway through July, and we've got another edition of the BrownsZone.com Zone Coverage podcast coming your way. Andy Barch with AM 930 WEOL and 100.3 FM. As always, joined at a safe social distance by Scott Petrak, Browns beat reporter with the Chronicle, Telegram, the Medina Gazette, and, of course, at BrownsZone.com. Scott, great to be joined by you as always, and I'm glad that you didn't melt in the middle of last week. I mean, it was a scorcher these last 7 days.
Yeah, it really has been. And, I'm trying to take some vacation before training camp, and the 90-degree weather's hurting my golf game a little bit. I've been able to play a little, practice a little, but it's tough to find people that want to play when it feels like about 105 outside.
Yeah, and it seems like today's not going to get much better. We might get a little bit of reprieval over the weekend, but then it's going to get right back into the 90s next week. Well, lots to talk about today, Scott, from David Njoku to Olivier Vernon, and we'll also get into what the expectation might be for the number of fans in the seats when it's time to play regular season games in September, and we'll come around to that golf shot of the week a little bit later on. But, Scott, let's begin with the David Njoku situation. It wasn't long after we wrapped up last week's show that the news came out about the Browns tight end wanting a trade or requesting a trade. And, Scott, that seems a little bit odd for a guy in his position, but also not surprising given his agent, Drew Rosenhaus. Given all of that, what are the chances he's gone by the start of the season?
It's really interesting, Bull, because I feel strongly about a couple things. Number one, I don't think Njoku is good enough as a player for, first of all, to demand a trade, right? Like, I don't think he's done anything to demand a trade. Now, that doesn't mean you can't demand a trade or request a trade, but he hasn't proved anything to me, number one. And I think that kind of puts the Browns in a kind of a funky spot because, number one, I personally would be fine if they traded him, right? Like, I don't think you lose anything from a roster standpoint. Or you don't lose that much from a roster standpoint if you trade David Njoku. But I also understand if you're Andrew Berry and it's your first time as a general manager, you don't want to just give in to anybody that requests a trade, right? You have to keep guys. It'd be too easy for then other guys down the road to say, hey, either I need a trade or I need a new contract. You have to be kind of strict, right? And you have to have some discipline, and you have to show that you won't be pushed around. So I think it's the case where, yeah, the Browns would be fine trading him, but they could also make an example of him and say, you know what, we think he still is the second best tight end on this roster, at least until rookie Harrison Bryant shows otherwise. We're going to run a significant amount of two tight end sets. We're not going to cave to his request, and the Browns have the leverage. If Njoku decides to hold out, it's not killing the Browns. I don't think if they try to trade him, they would get a ton in return. So I can see where Andrew Berry might say, you know what, I don't care if we wind up trading him, but I'm going to take a hard line here because he's a guy I can take a hard line with, and I understand that, and I'd be fine with that. I think when you talk about Njoku, some teams might be interested in him because he's physically gifted, right? We see the 6'4", 255 pounds, I think he is, can jump out of the gym, right? He was a national high jump champion in high school, is fast for a tight end, but it hasn't translated. He doesn't have the production. He's way too inconsistent touching the ball. I don't think he's a big-time – I know he's not a big-time blocker. So if you have all these kind of marks against him, the only reason a team would want him is because they think they could just kind of unearth that potential that hasn't come to the forefront yet. And I'm not saying it can never happen, but after 3 years, I know last year he's heard a lot of it, but I watched him in training camp and was not blown away at all. So, I just don't think he's ever going to be worth the pick the Browns gave up. I don't think anybody's going to give close to a first-round pick. So if you're Andrew Berry, maybe you hold out and say, hey, if somebody gives us a third-round pick, we'll trade him because we think that's great value for Njoku. But if we don't get that offer, we'll hang on to him and see if he shows up because I don't think Njoku can afford not to show up. He just doesn't have enough leverage. He's got 2 years left on his contract, for crying out loud.
Well, you mentioned that the Browns might accept a third-round pick, but what do you think the realistic going market is for a guy like David Njoku right now?
Yeah, I mean, you hear any time a guy gets on the trade market, I know fans want, we should get a first-rounder back. He was a first-rounder. To me, that seems ludicrous. He just hasn't played like a first-rounder, and I don't think there's any way you get anything close to that. So I could see a team offering a fourth-round pick. Maybe Andrew Berry can get the same deal that John Dorsey, the GM last year, got for Duke Johnson, right? It's a similar situation. Duke wanted a trade because the Browns, had Nick Chubb. They had signed Kareem Hunt. Duke had just signed a big kind of contract the year before, but that was under a different regime. Or actually, I think it was John Dorsey signed him to the extension, but then Duke wanted a trade anyway because of the acquisition of Kareem Hunt. So Duke changed agents to Drew Rosenhaus. David Njoku just changed agents to Drew Rosenhaus. And Dorsey said, we're not going to trade him, we're not going to trade Duke. Well, then he gets a fourth-round pick that turned into a third-rounder with playing time from the Houston Texans for Duke Johnson. If Andrew Berry could get the same type of deal, I think he would take it. I think it'd be the best he could expect to get. Now, maybe you could find a player. Maybe there's a linebacker on a team somewhere kind of in a similar situation, a rookie that's underperformed, or a guy on a rookie deal that is underperformed, and you can make that swap. But it's interesting because the Browns have been real complimentary of Njoku. Whether it's Andrew Berry, whether it's new coach Kevin Stefanski, they've been consistent in their belief that Njoku can turn into something. And they think Kevin Stefanski's offense will bring out some good qualities in David Njoku and a good production out of David Njoku. Andrew Berry was part of the Sashi Brown group that drafted Njoku. So the Browns have been supportive for really no reason of David Njoku, yet he wants that trade. So I find that really interesting, and it makes me question a little bit his attitude, which I know coaches in the past have also questioned.
Well, we go from one end to another, as the issue with David Njoku is, albeit kind of a minor one, but it is an issue. And as that one pops up, seems like another one has been resolved with Olivier Vernon restructuring his contract, so he's back for another year. Scott, I think we can officially squash the idea of Jadeveon Clowney coming to Cleveland. And do you think that this is the better outcome of those two possible scenarios?
I do. I do, Bull. And the Clowney situation was interesting to me because there's so much hype around Jadeveon Clowney. It started in his South Carolina days, and I remember the bowl game. Everybody remembers it, right? When he blew up the guy from Michigan and he knocked the guy's helmet off in the backfield, the running back. Like, that was a signature moment. If you talk about, like, plays of college football that stand out over the last decade, that's one of them. And it pops into your head, and I can picture I saw it yesterday. So you have that. You have the fact that he was a number one overall pick. You have the fact that he's tremendously gifted. And if you watch his pro career, there are games and times where he dominates and he takes over. But then there's stretches where he disappears or he's hurt. And injuries have been a big part of it, where he's hurt and is not able to live up to that vast potential. And we've seen it in the stats. At 9.5 sacks is the most in his career. And that's not something where you go, we're going to pay this guy $20 million, which was his original asking price when free agency started, or even 14. So you kind of have to balance the excitement factor over a big name like Clowney versus what he's done as a player. And it's not, you can't just go by sacks, and I know, some of the analytics sites really say that he plays well and he draws double teams and he might have a big impact if he were paired opposite Myles Garrett. But I saw what Olivier Vernon did last year, and plenty of people would say, well, he didn't do enough, right? And he was hurt 6 games in the last 8, and he only had 3.5 sacks. And I get that. But I think on a whole, I'm not convinced that Jadeveon Clowney is a better player than Olivier Vernon. I think they're pretty similar talents. I think Clowney's got a worse injury history than Vernon. Vernon's a little bit older. Vernon's had sack seasons better than Clowney's. Last year, I think Clowney had 3 sacks and Vernon had 3.5. So I just don't know if there's a huge difference in production. I think you go with the guy that you have. Vernon's supposedly healthy after the knee injury at the end of last year, did not require surgery. Clowney had injuries last year. I think he had surgery. Teams want to look at him, and so there's some unknown there. I think he wants more than the $11 million guaranteed that Vernon restructured his contract to, which saved the Browns $4 million. So I can't get on my pedestal and say that Vernon is a much better player than Clowney, and it's a no-brainer, because I do think Clowney has a higher upside. But I can say that, given the choice, I'm fine with Olivier Vernon over Clowney, especially if you're able to save any money. There's some continuity factor. I know the Browns have changed defensive coaching staffs, but he played on the same line with Sheldon Richardson and Ogunjobi and Myles Garrett. And I like the fact you can bring back your starting defensive line again this season. So I think overall it's a quality move for the Browns, especially if you consider the fact that I'm not sure Clowney wanted to play here. If the ESPN report is correct that the Browns offered Clowney the most money and he turned it down, now maybe he was just waiting for a better offer and wanted the money to go up. But if he's reluctant to play here, fine. Take the guy that's willing to come back, willing to take a pay cut for the guaranteed money, and that's Olivier Vernon. So I would not lose any sleep if I'm a Browns fan with the fact that the Browns have Vernon this year and not Clowney.
The continuity, as you mentioned, I think is a really big deal too, especially this year. Of all years when there's all this uncertainty as to when you might be able to work out together, having at least some kind of familiarity with the coaching staff or the personnel, that makes a huge, huge difference. Now the question becomes, Scott, how many people are going to be able to see these guys play in person? You wrote about this not long ago, talking about the letter the Browns sent to season ticket holders, talking about how things are certainly going to change. That's got to be expected. I still think it was cold water on the face of some, though, to a certain degree. Baltimore mentioned earlier this week that they're going to allow 14,000 fans into M&T Bank Stadium. Scott, based on that, what do you think the realistic expectation is for First Energy Stadium this fall?
I think that's about the number. Well, I really do. I think it's going to wind up being about 20% of capacity. And at First Energy Stadium, capacity is 60. I want to say 68. I don't know if it's 67, 800 or 6. I think it's 67, 835. So that puts you at about 20% of that's right around 14 or 15, or right around 14. And I'm still a bit conflicted about whether or not there should be fans in the stands. There's a risk for the players. There's a risk for everyone with the virus, and we see the spikes going on across the country now. But I know the league is hell-bent on playing a season, and I expect the players to go along with it. So they're willing to take that risk. And obviously the fans that showed up would be willing to take that risk too. I just don't know if I were the Browns, if I were the NFL, if I would bend over backward to try to force 14,000 people in the seats, especially when baseball's not having fans, NBA's not having fans. I get the fan experience. I get the crowd noise. I understand that it probably would not be hard to find 14,000 fans willing to take the extra risk of attending games and being in public during the pandemic. But if I were the Browns, I don't know if I would risk it, number one. But if you do decide to do that, then you obviously have to shrink the crowd significantly. You have to social distance. You have to disperse throughout the stadium. It's going to be a much different look. Everybody's going to be in masks, is what the Browns said in this letter. So it's going to be interesting to see if this holds true, right? Let's assume we still have a season. Let's assume nothing crazy happens and the NFL reverses course and there's a season. I just wonder what it would take for the Browns or the NFL as a whole to decide, say, hey, we're just not going to have fans at all, if they would reach that point or not. And yesterday and the day before, when the Ravens put out their statement, this is certainly pointing toward having some fans. and I still kind of shake my head about that. But then that brings up a bunch of other issues, Andy, like, right, who's going to be allowed? Who's not going to be allowed? How do you pick those 14,000 people?
Right. How do you prioritize that? It's a really good question, and with certain fan bases, that's a really difficult decision to make. And you had talked about how it really seems like right now the league is hell-bent on having a season, and I think it's hard to find somebody that doesn't feel that way about this. And J.C. Tretter voiced his displeasure with the NFL earlier this week in regards to how they have handled things, acting as if they believe they are somehow immune to this whole pandemic. Right. Scott, when you read things like that, you begin to wonder about the relationship between the players and the owners. It's hard to look at this and think that that relationship is getting any better.
Well, yeah, that's a great point. Well, and let me just go back to the other thing for a second. The tickets, the Browns gave all their season ticket holders the option of opting out of 2020, so that you can either just move your the money you paid towards 2021. You can get a refund and then pay later for 2021. So there will be no penalty in saying, hey, I'm not comfortable going to the games, or it's been a tough financial time for me. Let's reconvene before the 2021 season. Hopefully things have calmed down. Hopefully the economy's rebounded, whatever. Everybody who has Browns season tickets is in a different economic situation. So it's good that the Browns did that. They also said, by opting in, by saying, hey, we want as many tickets as possible, they can't guarantee anything because there might not be anybody in your seat, right? Because that might be one that's open for social distancing. They can't guarantee how many games a season ticket holder will be allowed to go to. So that creates its own issues as far as, who's going to be there. Do they do a lottery? Who knows? And the Browns are still working all those things out. But to get to the Tretter thing, to me, what's fascinating, Bull, is in March, the NFLPA barely passed the new collective bargaining agreement, right? So just imagine if the Players Association had not voted to accept the CBA offered by the owners, and then you have this pandemic, right? The vote happened right before the pandemic really kicked in. And you would have all this labor uncertainty. You would have the NFL claiming to lose, or not claiming, they'd be losing a bunch of revenue from stadiums that aren't filled, from training camps that aren't attended by fans, all those ways that they can make money. And we would have this such uncertainty, and then the players in the league would be fighting about medical and safety guidelines playing during the pandemic. So at least they got that CBA out of the way, and that was huge from a labor peace standpoint. And I think it did build up some level of goodwill between owners and players. I would argue not nearly enough, and I think the J.C. Tretter column the other day on the union website kind of speaks to that. We know J.C., and I really respect J.C., and I like him. He's one of my favorite guys to talk to in the locker room. His point is, and he has to defend his players. That's the job of union president, right? And he's not going to cave in, and the union's not going to just accept what the NFL says. So I think there is some posturing that goes into what JC says, and you see the same thing from DeMaurice Smith, the union head. But there's also some truth to it. And JC's been saying the same thing for the last few months, is this is going to look different. This season's going to look different. We have to make huge concessions toward the virus. And if you just listen to the NFL with going through its free agency, going through the draft, obviously they changed and they had the virtual off-season programs, but the insistence that there will be a season on time and a full 16-game season, you can feel if you're a player like, hey, they're putting kind of the cart before the horse. Let's take care of these safety issues first. And there has yet to be complete agreement between the union and the owners and the union. So that's what JC, I think, just wanted to remind everyone that, hey, we haven't agreed to these things, to everything, and the owners insist on playing, or they want to insist on playing, some preseason, whether it be 2 games is what the owners want. And JC says, how does that make any medical sense? You put players at risk another game. You put them on a plane for a game that's unnecessary, right? It's a practice game. And I think the players just want more, I don't know if the word is understanding, more concessions from the NFL, maybe just a greater emphasis or priority on the safety and well-being of the players. And I think sometimes if you're a player, you look at, say, hey, why are we playing a preseason game that's unnecessary? And you think that the owners don't really care. And I think that was the crux of JC's message.
Your point is very interesting about when they were able to create the new CBA before the pandemic really began. And if I remember correctly, Scott, there were a lot of guys that were not too pleased with the agreement, and there were some guys thinking that they should probably rethink that. So it's very difficult in these times, too. I think it's easy on the surface to look at this and say, you know what, these sides are really at odds. You see it in baseball all the time. I think really the only major sport that hasn't had many issues with this is the NBA, where it seems like the owners and the players are somewhat cohesive on this. With the MLB and the NFL, it doesn't seem like they're really on the same page with this, and it's tough to get on the same page. I mean, players want to play, but they want to be safe, and the owners, well, for the most part, they're trying to make sure that they can keep their business upright, and that's tough for a lot of people to do these days. So you can certainly see both sides of it, but I feel like we are really getting to that point of no return with this, where I think the players want an answer one way or the other, that if they're going to get out there and not just play, but if they're even going to practice, that all of the proper precautions have been taken on this, and who could blame them for that?
Exactly. And then we saw a report this week that the NFL approached the players and said, we want to put 35% of salaries in escrow because this is going to be such a tough financial year. Well, the players look at that and scoff, number one, and they say, obviously everyone can understand it's a tough time economically and for all businesses, and the NFL is not exempt from that. But if the value of your franchise goes up exponentially, right, then you're really not at risk. So the first time there's any risk in your business model, right, the NFL owners make money hand over fist every year, and they have for decades. So the first time there's a blip, you're going to say, hey, players, give us our money back. And that would rub me the wrong way, too, if I were a player. So it's such a difficult topic because, yesterday, and we're taping this Friday, so that was Thursday, there's a report that the NFL said there's going to be no jersey exchanges after games, and players can't talk to the opponents, right? You're supposed to stay 6 feet away. You won't see the hugging. You won't see kind of the group. There's a lot of group prayers that go on after games. The socializing that's become so familiar after games in all sports. And they want to, ban that because of the corona. They don't want, they want to eliminate one more way that you can spread the virus. Well, the players' reactions are, so you're going to ask us to go play 3 hours and 75 snaps, tackle each other, but I can't shake a guy's hand and I can't take his jersey. And I think that, and I understand why the players would say that, because it just seems so contradictory on its surface. On the other hand, if you're the league, you're also trying to limit as much risk as you can. And if you're going to play, you can't eliminate all risk, but then you can do virtual meetings. You can say, hey, let's not exchange jerseys that are full of DNA, right, and full of germs. So I think the league is in a tough spot, but having said that, I think it can do more to make the players feel more comfortable and more at ease and more even cared for or appreciated than maybe it has to this point.
Yeah, no question about that. And these next few weeks leading into training camp should be pretty fascinating as well to see if any of this does indeed get smoothed out. Well, speaking of smooth, let's talk about that golf game of yours, my friend. We've got the golf shot or golf shots of the week to talk about. Which shots stand out for you?
Well, I wish it were smooth. Well, it's been a little herky-jerky lately, but I have practiced this week. I'm sitting at a golf course again, so hopefully today will be better. I'm reading a golf book about golf psychology, how to think your way around a golf course, so hopefully all this pays off. But I do have a couple of shots I can bring up. I played Greyhawk in LaGrange, nice course. I said Monday. I played out there Monday, and number 7 is probably its signature hole, one of the tougher holes in the area, one of the better holes in the area. It's a par 5. It's real tight. There's water down the left. You have to carry water on your tee shot. You can't hit driver really because it gets too narrow. Anyway, I had a really good forehand off the tee, pretty good forehand second shot, iron on. I made a par, so it was a good par. So then you get to number 8, and it's a tight hole with a creek down the right. It's not very long, so I teed off with a 4-iron. And, of course, I just hit a couple good ones, and this one leaks and bounces into the creek. So I drop a little below my feet. I got about 180, and I hit this 5-iron. It faded about 5 yards, was all over the flagstick, and came and settled 2.5 feet from the hole. And I made the putt to save par. And it's just one of those where I was so frustrated because of the tee shot 4-iron, right? I thought, build on this par, you're feeling good over the ball, and then you hit a terrible tee shot. But I was able to recover and hit the great 5-iron to save par. Of course, my next tee shot went in the water too, but I'm going to think about that 5-iron instead of the water balls.
Very nice. Hazards be damned. You went up a creek and you were able to find your way out and still save par. That is outstanding. Very, very good stuff. Well, Scott, hopefully this next round you have will give us a whole new round of golf shots to talk about next week. Have a good weekend, and we'll do this again next week.
Sounds great. Thanks, Paul.
Thank you, Scott. Again, that's Scott Petrak, Browns beat reporter with the Chronicle, Telegram, the Medina Gazette, and, of course, at BrownsZone.com. That'll wrap up another edition of the BrownsZone.com Zone Coverage podcast. For Scott Petrak, this is Andy Bull Barch saying thanks again for tuning in, and we will talk to all of you again next week.